May 16, 1926, St. Petersburg Times, St. Petersburg, Florida. The amazing rampage of London's 40 elephants. How a remarkable gang of desperados, composed entirely of women, was finally broken up and its leaders jailed. London. The 40 elephants have at last been trapped. For months, London's most notorious gang, made up of women picked for either beauty or brawn, terrorized the Elephant and Castle district, in which they had their headquarters and played havoc with the stocks of expensive London stores. But a mass attack waged against the family of a renegade member of the gang brought the police, brought 9 members into court, and brought jail sentences for the 6 leaders. London, at last, breathes more easily. America has had its famous criminal organizations. Europe has had outstanding women crooks. But the 40 Elephants, police believe, is the first case of a gang of this size and viciousness being composed and directed by women and girls. The 2 leaders of these Amazons were typical of their gang's activities. The first was Alice Diamond, frequently called Diamond Alice, and the Queen of the 40 Thieves. She was known as the tallest woman criminal in London and is of terrific strength. Her criminal history includes every form of shoplifting and most of the forms of heavy-handed thuggery commonly practiced by the strongest and most desperate species of male robber. She was nearly always armed with a steel blackjack and repeatedly demonstrated her ability to use it. Her first lieutenant and, in fact, the co-leader of the gang when it came to planning its activities was Mrs. Margaret Hughes, better known as Baby-Faced Maggie. Mrs. Hughes has already achieved a reputation in crime that few men can claim. She has been in the courts more than 20 times, on charges ranging from theft and shoplifting to attempted murder. But her demure and dainty beauty, combined with the childlike appearance of innocence, has always secured her light sentences or complete discharge. It even caused the hardened old sergeant at Old Bailey, who has passed on an army of assorted criminals, to remark, "You look just like a baby." These 2 women of entirely different types led their gang of women along the 2 different lines they stood for. Scotland Yard calls them the 2 most expert shoplifters in the world, and they were, each in a different way. Diamond Alice led the heavyweights of the gang, who took care of the rough stuff whenever any was necessary. They were all armed, and each was picked for her toughness. They were quite ready to meet any equal number of men in an underworld argument, and by their heavy-handed way of working, brought the entire district in London lying between the Elephant and Castle and the Waterloo Road to heel. They extorted thousands of dollars from the smaller shopkeepers of the neighborhood. They also took care of any trouble that arose when their lighter-fingered comrades descended on the larger and more fashionable shops. Baby-faced Maggie led her part of the gang into higher class, but no less remunerative channels. While the foundation of the gang was laid on shoplifting, no source of revenue was rejected. This beauty department of the 40 Elephants frequently went in for innovations in the badger game and indirect blackmail. The police report, in several instances, wealthy victims took out one of the prettier members of the gang, ended up in the hands of the tougher members, and were stripped of everything of value. This group of women were always dressed in the height of style. Many of them were really beautiful. They passed without trouble through the expensive stores, into the parties of society during the season, and often secured employment in some of the big mansions in order to practice petty thievery or obtain the plans of the house when their associates contemplated burglary. These girl shoplifters had special clothes made with hidden pockets for their booty. As time passed, they grew so daring that they stole fur coats and entire rolls of silk. At the height of the gang's prosperity, police believe that its income amounted to several $1,000s a day, and every cent was spent in reckless parties and a desperate, hectic mode of living. Until the 2 leaders finally went to jail, they seemed to live a professionally charmed life. Frequently, individual members of the gang were arrested, but the organization never had any trouble bailing them out, and, generally, before they came up for trial, their robberies had more than equaled the amount of money that they were out on. Baby-faced Maggie was frequently suspect, but the police, after she joined the 40 Elephants, never seemed able to hold her. They knew her record well. They knew that her husband, Alfred Hughes, an outstanding figure in the history of London crime, had introduced her to the underworld while still a girl. So skillful did she prove herself that Hughes actually decided to marry her, and the ceremony took place during the period when they were out on bail together, pending trial in 1912. Eventually, Mrs. Hughes became bored with her husband's sponging ways and found another admirer. Frequent quarrels followed and ended one night when the ladylike gangster whipped out a razor she always carried in her stocking and sent her husband to the hospital. Later, she felt a certain amount of remorse for curtailing his earning power in this fashion and compensated him with a present of $250. But she was through with him and with men as professional companions. She joined the 40 Elephants and thereafter worked with women. Police tell a typical story of Diamond Alice, of how she carried out a shoplifting raid on a famous store, simply in a fit of pique. She was waiting at the London session for her name to be called when a woman detective employed by one of the largest department stores in London walked up to her. "Hello, Alice," the detective exclaimed. "You haven't been around to see us lately." Diamond Alice wheeled around on her sharply and replied, "No, but I will." She left the court, collected a half-dozen members of her gang, and told them of the incident which had wounded her pride. "I'll show her that she can't taunt the 40 Elephants," she added, calling a couple of taxicabs. Alice and her confederates drove to the department store and went straight to the silk department. Later that afternoon, it was reported to the store's detective that 14 bolts of silk had been stolen sometime during that very day. There was one other disreputable feature of the 40 Elephants that gained for it nearly as much notoriety as its criminal exploits. While the gang had no real male members, it kept half a dozen hangers-on, recruited from the more debonair and reckless of the masculine gunmen of London. These were retained, in much the fashion that an ordinary gang of thugs has several pretty girl accomplices. They were useful in undertaking sideline activities that could not be accomplished by a woman, and they lent a tainted touch of romance to the notorious parties that the 40 Elephants would throw in celebration of some daring bit of crime. But while the gang had its male associates to fight and bicker over, it frowned in true Amazonian fashion on all men outside its criminal circle. Diamond Alice and baby-faced Maggie fully realized the ruin that might be brought to their plans by a good-looking detective and a lovesick member of their group. They discouraged outside love affairs on the part of their followers in the direct and conclusive fashion of the underworld. In fact, the downfall of those two leaders and the smash-up of the gang resulted from just such an affair. One of the prettiest of the gang members had been a girl named Marie Britton, who came of good family according to the police, but she had fallen in love outside the sphere of the 40 Elephants, and she well knew what that meant. For some time she hesitated, drawn between fear and love. At last, summoning her courage, and with her father as a companion, she asked for an interview with Queen Alice, and told her of her hopes and desires to quit the criminal life for a home and a husband. A wild scene took place, in which Marie, fortunately for herself, managed to get her teeth into one of the fingers of Diamond Alice's hand, which was wielding a blackjack. She hung on for life until her father, who had first had to dispose of baby-faced Maggie and her little razor, could come to her rescue. The two then escaped, pursued by threats of revenge on the part of the gang, and Marie promptly married her lover, a man named Jackson. The 40 Elephants did not wait long. 2 days later, they gathered all their forces and actually stormed the Britton home, which lay in the center of London. One volley of stones and bottles by the 40 thieves broke every window in the house. Then, with wild cries, they dashed in, crashing through the window sashes and piling on top of each other in their effort to get at the renegade and her father. As it was close to midnight, they made for Britton's bedroom, but he was not there, having fled to protect his daughter, who was in another part of the house at the first sounds of attack. Britton's wife, with her baby child, was cowering under the bedclothes. She was hauled out, the blankets and her youngest child, who was sleeping with her, were thrown to the floor, and even the bed overturned in the search for Britton. Blocked here, the women gangsters started to search the house for their former member and her father. At the head of the stairs, they found Britton with his son. Both were armed with heavy clubs. Then took place one of the most famous battles in the history of London crime. The women, every one armed, attempted to force their way up the staircase defended by the two men. The staircase was narrow. Their very numbers handicapped them. The two men were desperate and were fighting against women who would show no mercy. Step by step, they were forced back, till finally Britain went down. But by this time, the startled street was ringing with police whistles. A squad of policemen arrived and hurriedly commandeered autos. They fell on the women from the rear and, fighting desperately, captured some 9 members of the gang, including the 2 leaders. Marie Britton was saved from the 40 elephants. Britton and his son were rushed to a hospital, where the former had 22 stitches taken in his head and body, but both survived their desperate battle. When the police gave out the details of the affair, the whole of London became aroused. The 40 elephants were broken up. The members were relentlessly tracked down by police in an effort to stamp out this organization of women that had terrorized an entire district of the city. The trial of the women gangsters was one of the most sensational that London has had in years. For a time, it was hinted that some of the secret records of the gang might come to light during the trial. A number of prominent persons in London society who had fallen victims of the gang's blackmailing activities, or who had become involved with some of the prettier members, were said to have been named in the gang's records. But either to avoid the resulting scandal, or because the evidence of the gang's other activities was incomplete, the prosecution rested its case on the assault on the Britton home. Many of the members were given long jail sentences. Diamond Alice and baby-faced Maggie were convicted of leading a criminal assault on the home of Britton. Each was given a long term at hard labor, and the wishes of the judge that it would teach them to exert their influences in more womanly spheres when they were discharged some years hence. Diamond Alice merely growled at the sentence, but beautiful Maggie shrieked hysterically to the court, "I'll be a proper villain when I come out." Newspaper Feature Service 1926.